Welcome to our podcast. We pick major historical events and look at them from each side's perspective. Our goal is to make you well-informed and try to minimize the winner's version of history that we so often find in textbooks. Today, we delve into one of the most consequential political upheavals of the 20th century, the 1979 Iranian Revolution. Why does this matter today? Because the events of 1979 didn't just transform Iran. They created a political system and an ideological model that continues to influence global geopolitics, regional conflicts in the Middle East, and the very definition of modern political Islam. This revolution replaced one of America's most critical allies with an antagonistic theocracy. It was a violent, complex, and stunning moment when a massive popular uprising rejected rapid, Western-backed modernization in favor of what they saw as divine guidance. To truly understand how this seismic event unfolded, we must listen to the distinct voices fighting for their version of Iran. Our roadmap today identifies three major parties who experienced this revolution entirely differently. First, we have Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini and the militant Shia clergy. For them, this was a divinely guided countermovement against decades of Western imperialism and corruption. Second, we have the Pahlavi monarchy, represented by Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi and the imperial state of Iran. For them, this was a foreign-backed conspiracy, a betrayal that halted Iran's destined progress toward global modernity. Third, we examine the viewpoint of the secular, liberal, and leftist opposition groups, including groups like the National Front and the Marxist Tudeh Party. These groups saw the revolution as a democratic struggle against tyranny, one that was ultimately stolen from them. We will now dive into each party's unique story, focusing on their motivations, their losses, and their definition of triumph. We will conclude with the common ground, the facts that everyone, regardless of bias, must agree upon. Let us begin with the story of the victors. Side 1. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini and the militant Shia clergy. For decades, Iran suffered under the yoke of the Pahlavi regime. This regime was rooted in deep corruption and complete subservience to Western imperialists, especially the United States. This tyranny demanded a powerful, divinely guided countermovement. The Shah's forced modernization, the so-called White Revolution, was nothing more than an attempt to strip the nation of its true Islamic identity. This attack on our culture is precisely what justified the massive popular mobilization directed by the clergy. We were the only institution left standing with the moral authority to speak for the nation. Our leader, Imam Ruhollah Khomeini, was exiled, yet his guidance never wavered. Even from the quiet Paris suburb of Nofal-e-Shadhow, the Imam sustained the widespread resistance. Religious gatherings across Iran, particularly the sermons during Ashura, were skillfully turned into centers of true revolution, disseminating the Imam's message through cassette tapes and pamphlets smuggled across borders. The reality was simple. The nation completely rejected the foreign-backed dictatorship. When the people spoke, the Shah had no choice but to finally flee in shame and defeat on January 16, 1979. The most decisive moment of our struggle came 2 weeks later. January 31, 1979, marked the date when the Imam departed France, signaling the imminent liberation of the nation from oppression. The glorious return of the Imam in February 1979 proved to the entire world that he was the rightful de facto head of state, restoring legitimacy after the long usurpation. The old order collapsed almost immediately. The comprehensive victory of the faithful was formalized when the Imperial Iranian Army revoked their allegiance to the throne on February 11th. This stunning triumph required immediate action. Our first duty was the swift declaration of the Islamic Republic, ensuring that the new state's foundation was pure and based entirely on divine law. It was clear to all true believers that the role of the Rahbar, the leader, fell naturally to the Imam. He was the only one capable of guiding the Ummah according to uncompromised Islamic precepts. To protect the revolution, The establishment of the new governance required the immediate institutionalization of the concept of velayat-i faqih, the rule by Islamic jurist. This structure was divinely ordained for the protection of the faith against both internal dissent and external corruption. We acted swiftly to dismantle the remnants of secular power. This cleansing of the political sphere was necessary to remove liberal and nationalist elements who sought to dilute our Islamic mandate. The militant Shia clergy succeeded in removing these secular nationalist and liberal elements from the political sphere because their initial utility in the revolution, which was mobilizing the masses, was now complete. The Constitution, affirmed in December 1979, codified the absolute authority of the supreme leader, formalizing the imam's position as the final authority over the state and jurisprudence. This cleansing process ensured that the clerical class maintained absolute, centralized control, preventing the factionalism that plagued previous, weaker movements. All perceived temporary allies, whether they were intellectual, leftist, or merely nationalist, were definitively sidelined. Their limited contribution was now outweighed by their potential to obstruct divine government. The new regime, under the imam's unflinching guidance, immediately took a resolute anti-Western stance, confirming our identity as the foremost anti-imperialist revolution in the world. Our victory was not merely for Iran, but served as the architectural blueprint for a global axis of resistance against imperialist and Zionist domination. It was our spiritual and political duty to immediately begin backing Shia militancy across the region, ensuring the spread of revolutionary Islam and combating corrupt Sunni influence that often served American interests. The February 1979 revolution guaranteed that a militant and revolutionary brand of Islam would become the prevailing source of political inspiration worldwide. Thus, the Islamic Revolution established the world's only true Islamic republic, setting the indelible standard for divine governance for all generations to come. Side 2. The Pahlavi monarchy, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi and the imperial state of Iran. The man on the throne saw the events of 1979 not as divine justice, but as a catastrophic failure fueled by foreign enemies and internal sedition. Our imperial state was successfully transforming Iran into a global power. Our reforms, especially the White Revolution launched in 1963, were generating the prosperity, education, and modernity that the reactionary elements simply could not tolerate. It was clear to us that the so-called opposition consisted purely of obscurantist clergy and radical Marxist elements, groups fundamentally opposed to Iran's destined progress and the secular foundation of the imperial state. They had no positive vision, only a desire to destroy. The entire turmoil of the revolution was not organic. It was financed and engineered by foreign powers who feared a strong, independent, and modern Iran led by our imperial state. This made the revolution a foreign conspiracy masquerading as popular will. Throughout 1978, the Shah took necessary steps toward political liberalization. But these gestures were recklessly interpreted by seditious groups as a sign of weakness, encouraging further illegal demonstrations and defiance of imperial authority. The exiled agitator, Ruhollah Khomeini, was simply a figurehead. He was a tool used by the enemies of progress and international conspirators to dismantle the monarchy and halt the social revolution we spearheaded. The initial disturbances throughout 1978 were not genuine expressions of popular will. They were orchestrated violence aimed at destabilizing our major cities and challenging the legitimate authority of the imperial state. The rapid influx of oil wealth did create a temporary climate of social upheaval, which the enemies of the state shamefully exploited by fabricating claims of widespread social injustice, despite our immense investment in the people through education and infrastructure. Our security forces were consistently hampered by the Shah's humanitarian desire to prevent bloodshed, a self-imposed restraint which tragically emboldened the violent, lawless mobs. On Black Friday, In September 1978, our security forces were forced to use necessary measures only when uncontrolled mobs posed an existential threat to order and the safety of law-abiding citizens in Jail Square. The number of casualties was vastly inflated by the opposition press. But the most devastating factor was the inexplicable withdrawal of support by our supposed Western allies, particularly the Americans. They abandoned the imperial state in favor of appeasing the revolutionary chaos. We were further sabotaged by misguided foreign advisors who pushed relentlessly for a policy of excessive political restraint, tying the hands of our loyal security forces at the critical moments of confrontation. In late 1978, the Shah attempted to appease the misguided public by appointing various civilian governments. But this strategic move was immediately undermined and rejected by the hardline extremists who demanded nothing less than the destruction of the state. Despite the overwhelming internal pressure, our imperial army maintained remarkable professionalism, constrained only by the Shah's ultimate determination to prevent a devastating civil war that would have torn the nation apart. The Shah's strategic decision on January 16, 1979, to leave Iran was not an abdication. It was a temporary absence based on medical necessity and a deliberate maneuver to deprive the opposition of the martyrdom they desperately sought by avoiding a direct confrontation. However, the Regency Council left in power was swiftly crippled by a combination of internal dissent and external intimidation from the newly emboldened clerical elements and their terrorist groups. The cynical return of Khomeini from Paris in February 1979 proved definitively that the forces of reaction were purely focused on seizing power, not addressing the supposed grievances of the people. The final act of internal betrayal that handed the country to the fanatics without a fight was the catastrophic and ill-advised declaration of neutrality by the Supreme Military Council on February 11, 1979. Immediately following the collapse of imperial authority, the ensuing chaos proved that the revolutionaries were utterly incapable of governance, plunging the nation into needless disorder and institutional destruction. The undeniable gains of the White Revolution, including land reform, literacy initiatives, and especially women's rights, were immediately undermined and reversed by the new reactionary regime that seized power. The Shah's memoir, Answer to History, remains our definitive testament, ensuring that the true reasons for our overthrow, internal sedition fueled by obscurantism and foreign betrayal by our so-called allies, are forever documented for the judgment of history. Side 3. Secular, liberal, and leftist opposition groups, e.g., National Front, Two-Day Party. We must remember where this story truly begins. The democratic aspirations of the Iranian people were violently crushed in 1953. The Shah's Pahlavi regime, installed after the CIA-backed coup that crushed the National Front's democratic government, was always an illegitimate tyranny serving Western imperialist interests. The so-called White Revolution was nothing more than a superficial, US-backed maneuver that solidified class distinctions and failed to address the fundamental economic suffering of the peasantry and the urban proletariat. It was a failure of justice. We, the organized opposition, particularly the Marxist-Leninist Two-Day Party, maintained a strong underground presence among students and workers, ensuring the necessary organizational framework for a true revolution was in place. It was ourselves, our organization, and our labor strikes that choked the Shah's ability to govern. The escalating protests of 1978 demonstrated that the people were unified against the Shah's repression by SAVAK, his secret police. We demanded the immediate establishment of a democratic, non-aligned republic, free from foreign influence, whether American or Soviet. In the initial stages, it was clear that the Shia clergy served as a useful, though inherently reactionary, vehicle to mobilize the masses in the final stage of the struggle against dictatorship. The Two-Day Party bravely issued statements demanding the total unity of all anti-Shah forces, recognizing that the immediate priority was the overthrow of the Pahlavi tyranny, even if it meant cooperating temporarily with religious opportunists. When the Shah fled in January 1979, the democratic forces of the National Front immediately stepped forward, ready to reclaim our historical mandate to establish a secular, constitutional government, much like the one the U.S. had helped destroy decades earlier. The revolutionary momentum that dissolved the military and state institutions in February 1979 was the result of years of organizing by our labor unions and intellectual cells, not merely clerical sermons. The provisional government under Mehdi Bazargan, though transitional, was rightly viewed by the National Front as a necessary step back toward the constitutional principles stolen from us in 1953. We immediately pressed for the implementation of radical reforms, including the nationalization of industries and comprehensive land redistribution that truly benefited the workers. But these demands were consistently obstructed by the liberal and religious factions already moving to secure their power. We made a catastrophic political error. We mistakenly believed the charismatic return of Khomeini was merely a potent psychological factor, trusting that his influence would naturally recede once a modern, secular state structure was established. The reality was swift and brutal. The clerical forces, immediately and ruthlessly, began seizing control of the crucial instruments of repression and justice, especially the powerful revolutionary courts. Our comrades in the Tudeh party were deeply split. While some recognized the inherent danger of clerical rule, the official leadership supported the Islamic direction, believing it was the only genuinely anti-imperialist stand available. This catastrophic decision to align with the clerical leadership fractured our united left front and gave the reactionaries the cover they needed to systematically purge our liberal and socialist organizations. The seizure of the U.S. Embassy later in the year was swiftly manipulated by the burgeoning theocratic clique. It was used to distract the public from the clerical failure to address economic justice and empower the working class, channeling revolutionary anger against an external enemy instead. It was soon obvious that the religious faction had no intention of upholding the revolutionary promise of political freedom. They simply replaced the Shah's dreaded SAVAK with their own committees of moral terror. The swift imposition of the doctrine of velayat-e faqih into the 1979 Constitution extinguished any lingering hope that a secular, democratic republic, championed by the National Front, would ever be realized. Throughout 1979, we watched as genuine demands for regional autonomy and national rights, supported by our democratic comrades, were violently crushed by the clerical regime's new forces. By the end of 1979, the revolution we fought and bled for, the democratic, anti-imperialist, and socialist revolution, was systematically betrayed, substituting one form of dictatorship for a far more insidious religious tyranny. The final, painful reality is that the sacrifices made by our students, workers, and patriots resulted not in freedom and justice, but in a new reactionary state that quickly moved to crush the very forces that had made the revolution possible. The shared reality. We have heard three fundamentally different narratives of the 1979 revolution. For the clerical class, it was divine liberation. For the monarchy, it was foreign conspiracy and internal sedition. For the secular forces, it was a democratic dream betrayed. Yet, despite these vast ideological canyons, there are crucial, undeniable facts that form the shared reality of this event. These are the points of intersection where all three perspectives ultimately overlap. First, there was massive and unprecedented popular participation in the street protests of 1978 and early 1979. Whether motivated by faith, rage at the Shah's repression, or economic hardship, millions of Iranians were willing to take to the streets and face down the regime, indicating a profound and widespread dissatisfaction. Second, the collapse of the Pahlavi state structure was rapid and overwhelming. Regardless of whether you believe it was due to the Shah's restraint or the overwhelming spiritual momentum, the imperial army and the civilian institutions simply ceased to function effectively in a matter of weeks. The sheer speed of the political implosion is undisputed. Third, the personal and charismatic role of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini was the decisive catalyst for the final overthrow. Even the secularists recognized his psychological power to mobilize the masses, and the Shah recognized him as the most dangerous figure. His physical return in February 1979 signaled the definitive end of the old order. Fourth, the revolution resulted in an immediate and fundamental shift in Iran's foreign policy to a staunch, resolute anti-Western stance, particularly aimed against the United States. This was a direct, rapid reversal of decades of close cooperation, a fact acknowledged and mourned by the Pahlavis and celebrated by the new regime. Fifth, the revolution was immediately followed by internal betrayals and factional purges. The political landscape was fluid in February, but by December 1979, the clerical faction had systematically marginalized and eliminated their temporary liberal and leftist allies through the consolidation of power in the revolutionary courts and the creation of a constitution dominated by the concept of clerical rule. Finally, the primary conflict that defined the revolution was, at its heart, the debate over modernization. The conflict was rooted in the disagreement over the pace and nature of secular westernization imposed by the Shah. The resistance movement drew its deepest strength from those who felt politically disenfranchised and culturally alienated by the speed and direction of that imposed progress. The 1979 Iranian Revolution was not a simple change of government. It was an epochal transformation that demonstrates how powerful ideology, popular mobilization, and sheer political ruthlessness can fundamentally reshape a nation's destiny. The legacy of these events continues to reverberate, making the different stories of 1979 essential listening, even today.